Hello, I'm Shaun Richards of Notayesmaneconomics, and today I want to talk to you about inflation. So numbers that have been released this morning, and the first thing that we kind of learnt from that is that we're approaching a period whereby we're going to see a turn, I think. What do I mean by that? The producer price numbers picked up, which means in the system there's a hint of higher inflation ahead. This is a change because it's been falling recently, and it poses a particular problem for the Bank of England because, of course, with its unreliable boyfriend-style U-turn a little while ago, it's now got itself into a little bit of a mess. It's what it calls looked through, inflation being above target, on the kind of assumption it was coming back down. Now it's going back up again, potentially, looking at the oil price, looking at where the pound is. It's in quite a mess. Moving on, there's the issue of how we measure inflation in the UK. This is, if not quite a hot topic, doing the rounds. The reason why I mean this is the House of Lords Economic Affairs Committee looked at this yesterday, except they managed, by some chance, to have 4 people who don't like the RPI, so there was no balance. Let me give you an example of where I think this all goes wrong. We're told that you can't put house prices into an inflation measure. One of the things that the RPI does is it has them, a bit over 8%, 8.3%. It also has mortgage interest rates, 2.4%. So in case you're wondering why it tends to have higher numbers, it's because it at least has a go at trying to measure the situation there in owner-occupied housing. There's a new number, and I'm sorry for the alphabetic spaghetti here, but CPI-NA it's called, which is a new version trying to have a go at that. But rather than more than 10% looking at owner-occupied housing, it's down to 6.8%. You think, okay, how's this happened? Well, that's because they've decided in the new era you can have rising house prices, but you can't have the rising value of the land. So that's their way of sort of getting the numbers a bit lower. You might think that's fair enough, but if we move on to what they call their preferred number, which is now CPIH, you may, by the way, have to look quite hard for that this morning, because most places sensibly ignore it. But what that puts in is rents. Now, rents for people that pay rent, fair enough. But they assume if you own your own house, believe it or not, you rent it to yourself. So they put in a number for rents, and this gets worse because they've had real troubles measuring it and they undermeasure it. And then once you put all that in, you find that in weighting terms, it's now 16.8% of the index. So if we go back, the same set of houses that are only 6.8% are suddenly 16.8%. Even worse, they managed to put in a lower number because rents are growing at 1% a year rather than 3.9% of house prices. So as you can see, even though house price growth has fallen, they've found a way of bringing in a much lower number. This is the essential problem here, bringing it back in to the housing market and how you measure inflation. In the UK, this is a big deal. A bit less than 2/3 of people actually own their own house, whether they own it outright, whether they have a mortgage. This is a really big deal on what they pay out each month. The authorities want to ignore it. Why? Because it brings, just by chance of course, the inflation numbers down. This is a debate I intend to take forward at the Royal Statistical Society later. You've already had a précis of what I intend to say. But this is a really big deal, and it cuts across a lot of things. Yesterday, people were looking at real wages. Well, those numbers look better if you get inflation down. I think that's not right, because if people look at what they pay out each month, a lot of it is on housing, be it rents, whether it be mortgages, whether they paid for it outright in the first place. So this issue keeps spinning around, and it has another subset. You see, these numbers go into the GDP numbers. Those of you thinking of the maths of this might already know where I'm heading. UK GDP growth would have been lower if we had the RPI in it rather than the CPI, because when you put your inflation measure in, it subtracts from what you've made, and the real number after inflation's lower. So this spirals through the system in quite a lot of ways, giving numbers which turn out, surprise, surprise, in the favour of the government, the establishment, whoever wants to look at this. We get told there's less inflation, we get told we're better off, but the problem is, some people do gain. If you've made money on your house, good luck to you, and you've sold it. But on the other side, new buyers that come in and then have to try and pay are facing inflation, except no one wants to measure that. And this is one of the biggest problems I think we face in the UK. Because how often does this discussion turn around to house prices and the effect? Nice for some, nice if you already have assets, but this is a long sort of lasting conversation at the minute. What about those that are left out? And what about those that find it more expensive? This is a really big deal because each time these various numbers come out, be it inflation or economic growth, these are churned over to 0.1%. But as I've just explained here, there are bigger factors at play. They're a lot bigger issue than that, yet they get ignored. Not unreasonably for those that don't understand it, but I'm sorry to have to tell you that there's been a concerted campaign, in my experience definitely for the last 6 years when I've been arguing my case, for those pushing it the other way. And it is, each time, it's the same way. Lower inflation number, which makes the other variants look a lot better. That is one of the biggest problems we face going forwards. Why isn't it more in the news? Partly, people do not understand it. Also, the establishment promotes people who push this forwards. For example, I gave evidence to the Office of Statistics Regulation on this subject. They're back now claiming that they're experts on it, at least they were in the claim to be at the House of Lords yesterday. Yeah, my discussions with them, frankly, I was left with the impression that they're out of their depth.